Hello, everyone, and welcome to BuyerFirst Real Estate and Lending Sales Academy. Today's coaching is called The Art of the Close. Our goal today is to develop one of the most important skills any sales professional can master, the ability to guide conversations from discussion to decision. Guys, closing is often misunderstood. Lots of less seasoned sales professionals think of closing as a single dramatic moment at the end of a presentation. Unfortunately, the reality is very different. Closing is not a moment. Closing is a process. Throughout today's training, we're going to break down the psychology behind that process, show you how to build agreements step by step, and teach you how to use the right close at the right moment. By the end of this training, you'll understand how to move conversations naturally toward commitment without pressure and without resistance. This program is built around four core components. First, we're going to define what closing really means and why many agents misunderstand it. Second, we'll explore tie-downs, which are the micro-commitments that move buyers toward agreement. Third, we'll walk through 8 different types of sales closes and explain when each one is most effective. And finally, we'll talk about how to read buying signals and avoid the most common closing mistakes. The goal is not just to give you techniques, it's to give you a framework for understanding how decisions are made. So let's start with the real definition of closing. A close is the moment when a conversation moves from discussion to decision. But here's the key point. Most agents think closing happens at the end. In reality, closing begins the moment the conversation starts. Every agreement you secure along the way builds momentum toward the final decision. This is why experienced professionals never wait until the end of a conversation to close. They begin building agreement from the very first interaction. By the time the final close arrives, the buyer has already said yes many times. This brings us to one of the most powerful tools in consultative selling. The tie-down. A tie-down is a question designed to secure agreement with a statement you just made. Think of it as a micro-commitment. Tie-downs transform a one-way presentation into a collaborative dialogue. They serve 3 important purposes. First, they confirm the buyer understands what you just explained. Second, they collect small agreements that build psychological momentum. And third, they move the buyer closer to the final decision naturally. Instead of asking for one big commitment at the end, tie-downs build a series of smaller agreements throughout the conversation. The reason tie-downs are so effective comes from a core principle of human psychology. People prefer to behave consistently with their previous statements. Once someone has said yes repeatedly during a conversation, saying yes again feels natural. This is called the consistency principle. Every agreement builds alignment. Each yes reinforces the idea that you and the buyer are on the same side. By the time you reach the final close, the decision feels like the logical next step rather than a new commitment. Let's walk through several tie-down examples that can be used throughout a buyer consultation. The key to using tie-downs effectively is to keep them natural and conversational. You never want them to feel scripted or mechanical. Instead, they should feel like normal conversation. Here's one of the most versatile tie-downs. That makes sense, doesn't it? This is ideal after explaining a process or concept. When the buyer says yes, they are confirming 2 things. First, they understand the concept. Second, they agree with the concept. Fair enough? When do you use this? You should use this when introducing a process, guideline, or expectation, particularly early in the consultation when you're establishing how you work together. Why does this work? This phrase is disarming and conversational. It signals respect for the buyer's perspective while still securing agreement. It is especially effective with skeptical or analytical buyers because it feels collaborative rather than directive. Guys, fair enough is one of the simplest tie-downs you can use, but it's incredibly powerful. It works best early in a conversation when you're establishing how the process will work. For example, after explaining your consultation structure, you might say, Before we start looking at homes, we take a few minutes to clarify your goals, timeline, and financing so we can focus only on the right opportunities. Fair enough? That short phrase invites agreement without pressure and sets the tone for a collaborative conversation. You can see how that would help protect you, right? When do you use this? Use this when discussing strategy, contract terms, or any protective measure that benefits the buyer. This works well when you are walking through offer strategy or contingencies. Why does this work? By framing your service as protection, you reinforce your value. The buyer isn't just agreeing to a statement. They're acknowledging that they need what you provide. That's something you'd want to avoid, correct? When do you use this? Use this when identifying a risk, common mistake, or a negative outcome that your guidance helps prevent. This is particularly effective during the consultation opening. Why does this work? People are more motivated by loss avoidance than by gain. This tie-down taps into that instinct and positions your expertise as the solution to a problem they already care about. Guys, remember, in order for these to be effective when you are ready to use them, you must practice. You've heard me say this in other videos, but here it is again. Take time to practice these tie-downs out loud and in front of a mirror. The mirror allows for you to adjust your body language and expression. You'd want clarity before moving forward, right? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing preparation, pre-approval, or the importance of understanding the process before taking action. Why does this work? Almost every buyer will say yes to wanting clarity. This tie-down makes them active participants in their own preparation and sets the stage for your consultation structure. That would make the process easier, wouldn't it? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing how your system, structure, or tools simplify the transaction for the buyer. Why does this work? Buyers universally want a smooth, stress-free experience. Agreeing here reinforces their desire for structure and affirms your role in delivering it. You'd agree preparation is important, right? When do you use this? Use when explaining your consultation strategy, your process, or why a structured approach matters before beginning a home search. Why does this work? This is nearly impossible to disagree with. It establishes a shared value, and once the buyer agrees that preparation matters, they're implicitly agreeing to engage in your process. That approach would give you more confidence, correct? When do you use this? You should use this when introducing the value of a buyer consultation, pre-approval, or a structured representation agreement. Why does this work? Confidence is a core buyer need. This tie-down connects your approach directly to an emotional benefit, making the buyer feel seen and understood, not just feeling like they were being sold. Remember, buyers love to buy, but they hate to be sold. That would put you in a stronger position, wouldn't it? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing negotiation strategy, pre-approval strength, or how your representation gives the buyer a competitive edge in the market. Why does this work? Buyers want to win. Framing your value in terms of competitive advantage speaks directly to their desire to succeed and positions you as the key to that outcome. You'd want your agent protecting your interests, right? When do you use this? You should use this directly before presenting or discussing an exclusive buyer representation agreement. This is a critical setup tie-down. Why does this work? By first securing agreement on the value of protection, you make the exclusive agreement feel logical, even necessary. The buyer isn't signing a form. They're formalizing something they already agreed they wanted. That would help avoid surprises, correct? When do you use this? You should use this during the process explanation phase, particularly when walking through timelines, inspections, appraisals, or closing procedures. Why does this work? Nobody likes surprises in a real estate transaction. This tie-down taps into anxiety reduction and reinforces your role as the professional who keeps things predictable and under control. That's something most buyers appreciate, isn't it? When do you use this? You should use this to normalize a concept, service, or expectation, particularly when introducing something the buyer may be unfamiliar with. Why does this work? Social proof is powerful. When buyers hear that others appreciate something, they're more likely to align with that view. This tie-down subtly invokes peer behavior to reduce resistance. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing expectations around pricing, timelines, communication, or your service model. Why does this work? No one wants to appear unreasonable. This tie-down gently pressures agreement through social framing, and it works especially well with logical, detail-oriented buyers who want everything to make sense. You'd prefer a smooth process, right? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing planning, communication expectations, or your step-by-step system for guiding buyers to closing. Why does this work? A smooth process is universally desirable. This tie-down connects your organizational approach to an emotional outcome the buyer already wants, reinforcing that following your system is in their best interest. That would make decision-making easier, correct? When do you use this? You should use this during property evaluation discussions, particularly when introducing comparison frameworks, needs analysis, or priority setting exercises. Why does this work? Decision fatigue is real. When you offer a tool or framework that simplifies evaluation, this tie-down helps the buyer recognize its value and thank you for it before they even use it. You'd want to feel confident before making an offer, right? When do you use this? You should use this just before discussing offer strategy, comparative market analysis, or the factors that go into crafting a competitive offer. Why does this work? Making an offer is one of the most stressful moments for a buyer. This tie-down validates that emotion and positions your strategic guidance as the solution, making them more receptive to your recommendations. You'd rather avoid unnecessary risk, correct? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing contingencies, inspections, title review, or other protective elements of the transaction. Why does this work? Risk aversion is one of the strongest buyer motivators. This tie-down helps the buyer consciously connect your protective strategies to their personal peace of mind, making those strategies feel essential, not optional. That would help you move forward confidently, wouldn't it? When do you use this? You should use this when discussing financing, pre-approval status, or the importance of understanding purchasing power before beginning the search. Why does this work? Confidence in financing is a prerequisite for confident action. This tie-down bridges the gap between financial preparation and emotional readiness, helping the buyer feel empowered rather than exposed. You can see how this benefits you, right? When do you use this? You should use this when explaining a specific aspect of your service model, your process, or your access to resources that give the buyer an advantage. Why does this work? This is a direct invitation for the buyer to confirm their own awareness of your value. When they say yes, they're selling themselves, which is always more persuasive than you doing it for them. Not every buyer is the same, and not every moment calls for the same close. The most effective agents maintain a toolkit of closing techniques and select the right one based on where the buyer is emotionally and logistically. Understanding when to use each close is just as important as knowing how to use it. During this section, we will review several proven closing methods that help guide buyers from interest to commitment. Each closing technique works best in specific situations depending on the buyer's confidence level, market conditions, stage of the conversation, and emotional readiness to decide. Mastering multiple closing techniques allows you to adapt your approach naturally instead of forcing a single style of closing. At this point, we've spent time discussing tie-downs and how they build small agreements throughout the conversation. Now we're going to move into the actual closing techniques. Think of tie-downs as the steps that lead up to the close. The closes themselves are simply the moment where you guide the buyer to the next action. A great sales professional doesn't rely on just one close. They understand multiple closing strategies and choose the one that fits the situation. The key idea to remember here is flexibility. Different buyers respond to different approaches, and mastering several closing techniques gives you the ability to adapt in real time. The first closing technique we're going to discuss is called the assumptive close. This close works exactly the way it sounds. You move forward as if the decision has already been made. For example, instead of asking, "Would you like to see the property?" you say, "Let's schedule the first showing." The assumptive close works best when the buyer has already demonstrated interest and engagement. They've asked questions, they've shown curiosity, they've begun imagining themselves in the home. In those moments, asking for permission can actually slow the momentum. Instead, confident agents simply guide the next step. The important thing to remember here is that confidence communicates leadership. When you move forward naturally, many buyers follow your lead without hesitation. The second technique is the alternative choice close. This close removes the yes or no decision entirely. Instead of asking whether the buyer wants to move forward, you offer two options that each move the process forward. For example, would tomorrow or Saturday work better for a showing? Notice what happened there. The buyer is no longer deciding whether to proceed. They are deciding how to proceed. This subtle shift removes friction from the decision. The alternative choice close is particularly useful when working with buyers who tend to overthink decisions. By narrowing the options to two choices, you simplify the decision-making process and keep momentum moving forward. The summary close works by reconnecting the buyer to their own priorities. Throughout a conversation, buyers tell us what matters to them. They might mention wanting more space, a shorter commute, or a stable long-term investment. The summary close simply reflects those priorities back to them and connects them to the solution. For example, you mentioned that you're looking for more space, a shorter commute, and a property that will hold value long-term. This home checks all three boxes. What makes this close so effective is that you're not introducing new information. You're simply organizing the information the buyer already gave you. When buyers hear their own priorities reflected back to them, they feel understood, not pressured. And that sense of understanding often moves them toward a confident decision. The trial close is a diagnostic tool. Instead of asking for the final decision, you test the buyer's readiness. For example, if we found the right home today, would you be ready to move forward? This question accomplishes two important things. First, it reveals the buyer's level of commitment. Second, it uncovers hidden objections that may not have been expressed yet. If the buyer says yes, you know you're working with someone who is serious. If they hesitate, you've just discovered something important that needs to be addressed before moving forward. In other words, the trial close helps you identify and solve problems earlier rather than discovering them at the last moment. The urgency close is based on one of the strongest motivators in human behavior, the fear of missing out. When buyers recognize that an opportunity may not last, they are more likely to act decisively. For example, properties like this typically receive multiple offers, and this one has only been on the market for 2 days. It's important to emphasize that urgency should always be based on real market conditions. Artificial pressure damages trust. But when urgency reflects genuine market dynamics, it helps buyers make timely decisions rather than missing opportunities. Used correctly, the urgency close isn't about pressure. It's about providing honest context so buyers understand the timing of the market. The question clothes is one of the most powerful tools when a buyer seems hesitant but hasn't explained why. Instead of pushing forward, you ask a question that reveals the obstacle. For example, what would stop you from moving forward? This question changes the dynamic of the conversation. Instead of trying to persuade the buyer, you invite them to explain their concern. Often, buyers hesitate simply because they have unanswered questions. Once those questions are addressed, the hesitation disappears. The question closed turns the agent from a salesperson into a problem solver. The soft close is the lowest pressure closing technique. It's designed for cautious or analytical buyers who need more time and space to make decisions. For example, would it make sense to explore this further? Notice that this question doesn't demand a decision. It simply invites the buyer to continue the conversation. The soft close works especially well early in a relationship or when introducing a new idea. It keeps the dialogue moving forward without triggering resistance. Sometimes the most effective way to move a buyer forward is to reduce pressure rather than increase it. The final closing technique is the commitment close. This is the moment when you formally ask the buyer to move forward together. For example, are you comfortable working together so I can fully represent your interests? This close works best after all the groundwork has been completed. By the time you reach this moment, the buyers should already understand your process, your strategy, and the value you bring to the relationship. If tie downs have been used effectively throughout the conversation, the commitment close doesn't feel like a sales pitch. It feels like the natural next step in a collaborative partnership. Now that we've covered several types of closes, the next important skill is recognizing when to begin closing. Buyers rarely announce that they're ready to move forward. Instead, they reveal their readiness through small behavioral signals. These signals often appear during conversations or property tours. For example, when a buyer starts asking detailed questions about the property, things like HOA fees, school districts, or closing timelines, that tells us they are moving beyond curiosity and into decision-making. Another strong signal is when buyers begin discussing financing. If they ask about down payments, mortgage options, or monthly payment scenarios, it means they are mentally calculating what ownership would look like. One of the strongest signals occurs when buyers begin imagining their life in the property. Statements like, "My furniture would fit perfectly here," or "This room would be great for the kids," show emotional connection. At that point, the conversation should begin transitioning toward closing. Finally, when buyers start comparing properties, ranking one against another, they are actively narrowing their choices. That is the perfect moment to guide them toward a decision using a summary close or a trial close. Recognizing these signals allows you to move naturally into closing rather than waiting for a moment that may never come. Folks, even experienced agents sometimes struggle with closing, not because of market conditions, but because of avoidable habits. Let's look at 4 of the most common closing mistakes. The first mistake is talking too much. Once you've explained the value and asked for the close, silence becomes your most powerful tool. Many agents continue talking because silence feels uncomfortable. But over-explaining often introduces objections that the buyer hadn't even considered. The second mistake is fear of rejection. Avoiding the close doesn't protect the buyer, it simply prevents progress. A well-timed close is not pressure, it is clarity. The third mistake is avoiding direct questions. Vague language produces vague responses. Confident professionals ask clear questions that guide the buyer toward a decision. The final mistake is rushing the decision. Pressure creates resistance. Closing should feel calm and collaborative. The best closes feel like the natural conclusion of a well-led conversation. Folks, as we wrap up this coaching session, there is one principle that every successful closer understands. The best closes never feel like a sales maneuver. They feel like the natural next step. When you've taken the time to understand the buyer's goals, answered their questions, and gathered agreement through tie-downs along the way, the close becomes easy. The buyer already feels aligned with you. They already trust the process, and they already understand the value of moving forward. At that point, the close is simply confirming a direction the conversation has already taken. Remember this, closing is not something you do to a buyer. Closing is something you guide them through, one agreement at a time. I hope this coaching session has given you a few more tools for you to practice and use in real time. Remember to sign up for my other coaching webinars to help you build your skills and increase your book of business. Click on the link in the description area and follow me on Insta and like and subscribe on Facebook and YouTube. Until next time, I'm D. Wilmore. Thanks for participating.